Welcome into another episode of the Sportscaster and Her Son, where sports bridges a gap between the generations. I'm your host, Jason Conander. I am a Generation Z junior at the University of Texas at Austin. Here I am involved in Texas student television. You can follow me on Twitter at Jason Conander, where I love to talk White Sox baseball, Longhorns football, and everything in between. Today I'm hosting solo without my mom. She is on vacation, much needed break from her Bears coverage. So we will be talking about, yes, the Chicago White Sox, the biggest disaster in town, the 2022 Chicago White Sox. To summarize, the season was a complete mess, and I have watched the team since 2012. I was in fourth grade. That season, they went 83-79. They missed the playoffs by 3 games, were in first place for the entire summer until slipping out in September. That was my intro to baseball. I didn't think it could get much worse than that. I was wrong. This season was so much worse than that. This season was so much worse than a 99-loss season. This season, the White Sox not only had championship aspirations, they had a championship roster. They finished with a championship roster. But those players were not championship players. It became very apparent early in the season that this team was not coached well. A lot of people, myself included, admittedly, rejected that notion. We thought that it was just, early season jitters. Guys are a little bit rusty. They didn't have a spring training. And then we get to June and July, and it's like, okay, what's going on? The White Sox aren't winning. Towards the All-Star break, they start winning. They narrowed the gap with Minnesota, and we all kind of had this expectation that they'd come back from LA in the All-Star game, and they would immediately take over the Central and would run away with the division by 10 games like everyone, myself included, thought that they would. And that's not at all what happened. The White Sox missed the right decision at every single decision-making avenue this year, whether it came to roster decisions going into the season. They did not add the power bat that they should have, and they ended up not hitting any home runs. They did not add the rotation depth that they thought that they should have. They did add Johnny Cueto, but that wasn't depth. They added Johnny Cueto right as the season was starting. They needed to add another starter. And as soon as Lance Lynn went down, as soon as Michael Kopech went down, the White Sox were throwing out Vince Velasquez and Davis Martin. And God bless Davis Martin, because he actually had a good year. So that was another thing. At every decision-making junction, things were wrong. You saw the in-game decision-making from LaRussa. That was heavily scrutinized. And LaRussa's tenure as a whole was a decision that was made incorrectly, because there were so many junctures this season where it would have been justified to fire him. It became very clear, and it has been clear since way before I was born, since way before some of our listeners were born, Jerry Reinsdorf is not going to fire Tony LaRussa again. And it literally took Tony LaRussa's heart almost giving out for him to not be the manager of this team anymore. And we do hope that everything's well with Tony LaRussa. He was out at Medina golfing last year. I had the unbelievable opportunity to meet him, and he is an unbelievable guy. He is a class act. Say what you will about him as a manager, but we really do hope that everything is well with Tony from a health standpoint, because I think that the sentiment around him as he's left the White Sox is getting a little ridiculous. We have to remember that he's a human too. Now back on track with the White Sox. Everything went wrong. Everything went wrong. This was a division that they should have ran away with. The Cleveland Guardians are the youngest team in baseball. The Minnesota Twins obviously were not making the playoffs. I had said this since the beginning of the season. That rotation was never going to make the playoffs. But the Guardians had a rotation that could make the playoffs. And that rotation is going to be pitching in the playoffs, because that team did all the little things so much better than the White Sox did. They actually wanted to win. They wanted to be there. And that's my last point. When you have somebody like myself, I never even played sports in high school. I've watched sports my entire life. I have idolized athletes really up until I got to college. Every time I am watching the White Sox, every time I'm really watching most sports, I can really sit there and think, okay, I love my life, but if I were to trade spots with this person, I would do it in an instant. And when I see players like Luis Robert, and I do understand that they were asked to not run at full speed. When you have players like Luis Robert, not to continually call him out, but Robert, Moncada, Larry Garcia, it's been an issue with everyone on the roster this year. When you have guys that aren't even half running out ground balls, they're a fourth running out ground balls, or they're walking back the dugout after a fly ball, or not taking the extra base, not hitting the cutoff man. All these fundamental things that I was taught in fourth grade over 10 years ago that I was taught, and I still remember, and this team wasn't doing correctly, excruciating to watch. And I don't blame the fan base for being rampant. I don't blame the fan base for tearing this team to shreds. Do think it's been a little out of pocket at times, but this fan base is angry, and there are so many question marks about a team that seem to be such a sure thing going into the season. So in my opinion, there's no better person to talk to about this White Sox season than one of the people that has been there every step of the way, Chuck Garfien from NBC Sports Chicago. Chuck, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be on with you. I know Peggy's not here, your mom, but great to be with her son, Jason. Big fan of both of you.
Thank you. Even though my mom's not here, we'll still have a little fun, talk some White Sox. As fun as it can be to talk the White Sox at this time of the year. I just want to start off. So you have covered the team since 2004. My mom would always tell me growing up, there's nothing worse than covering a bad team. Where does this year's team rank in terms of most difficult seasons to cover?
Well, technically, my first season covering the team was 2005. I started working for what we were known as at the time Comcast Sportsnet in 2004. Just semantics there. But yeah, 2005. That was a magical first year for me to cover the White Sox. Oh, just go ahead and win the World Series. It's going to be like this every year, isn't it? What's it like covering a team like this? Is that what you asked, or what was the question?
It's almost like a two-parter. So what is it like covering a team like this is just as good of a question. But of all the years you've covered a World Series, you've covered playoff teams, you've covered close to 100 lost teams, and now you've covered this team. Where does this team rank in terms of most difficult teams to cover?
All right. Well, I will say in terms of just being a fan of a team, worst season just following the White Sox team since 1984, because in 1983, the White Sox won 99 games. They went to the ALCS. They had the Cy Young Award winner in Lamar Hoyt. They were just loaded. Tony LaRussa was the manager, ironically. And then the next year in 1984, they won 74 games. They won 74 and 88. Everyone who had a great season in 83, they were just flopped in 84. In terms of covering the White Sox, this is the worst season since 2007. 2005, they won the World Series. 2006, they had a great first half. They ended up winning 90 games. If they had the current wild card system in place, I'm pretty sure they would have made the wild card, but they didn't. So they missed the playoffs. And then in 2007, with essentially the same team, they won 72 games. They won 72 and 90. So the highs of 2005 and even 2006, they just fell flat on their faces in 2007. So I would say that's probably the comparison. Not everyone was picking the White Sox to win the division in 2007 because there was a lot of competition from the Indians and the Twins. But this year it was just they were the runaway favorites. No team was going to touch them. And this has been a disaster, really a disaster for when you look at the expectations and where things have lined up.
Yeah, and the expectations and where things have lined up is the biggest thing, I think, for everyone, because when you look at the team, they're going to finish right around 500. For most teams, it's not that bad of a year, but when you look at the division, you look at the roster coming in, what they had done the past 2 years, it's completely unacceptable. So there's so much to unpack from this season, so many different storylines, LaRussa and then Miguel Cairo, and then the players being hurt and what have you. But if you were to summarize sort of briefly, what is the main reason why the 2020 White Sox didn't work?
Main reason. I mean, we've been just talking this over constantly for the last several months now. What's going on with this team? What is wrong with it? And to choose one thing would be wrong because it doesn't tell the whole story. It's managing, it's coaching, it's players, it's the offense, it's leadership, it's I mean, really from A to Z, it really is. But if I was to say, the biggest thing, just from a statistical standpoint, the biggest things have been this: so many hitters, so many key members of this team failed to meet expectations and had such awful years offensively. Yoan Moncada and Yasmani Grandal, the two biggest. Luis Robert, 2 RBIs in the second half. This is a guy who should be contending for an MVP. He was hurt a lot. He's going to play less than 100 games. Tim Anderson, less than 100 games. He's going to play less than half the season. Okay. And even when he was in, he had a good batting average, but he wasn't the Tim Anderson that we've seen in the past. He only had 25 RBIs. Not, you don't expect a lot of RBIs from the leadoff position, but he just wasn't. He wasn't like taking over games too much. He had a big home run in New York against the Yankees, but he wasn't really having those Tim Anderson seasons we've seen in the past. Jose Abreu has half the amount of home runs that he had last year. So it's really everything. Everything went to SHIT. I mean, I'm just being honest. That's
yeah. And before we get more into the coaching and the manager spot, because that's really the hottest news ever since they have been eliminated from the playoffs, I want to elaborate more on the players, because going into this year, the biggest thing that this White Sox team had was a great core. And there were a lot of guys that I think the fans and the analysts thought were sure things. Luis Robert, Yasmani Grandal was off a strong season. Jose Abreu didn't necessarily have a bad season, but like you said, the guys didn't live up to expectations. So when you look at the way the roster will be constructed for next season, some of the guys that didn't live up to expectations, Yohan Moncada, Yasmani Grandal, which of those guys do you think are in jeopardy of not being on the team next year? Could be traded, could be non-tendered. What do you think the lack of performance from some of these guys, what do you think that impact is going to have on their status in the roster?
That is a great question. That is a question that will be answered at some point. It really is going to depend on how much they're willing to blow it up. What would I do? I'd blow it up. And when I say blow it up, I'm not saying like trade everybody. They need to make some changes. They have to decide who on this team fits. And not just on the field, off the field, in the clubhouse. Who is a fit, who's not a fit. And to make some of these moves, they're going to be costly financially. Because I've listed two names, Moncada and Grandal. Those are not easily movable parts. They're coming off their worst seasons in their careers, and they have high price tags. So the White Sox have to make a decision. Are they willing, if they decide to cut loose with either of these guys or both of them, how much are they willing to do that? Or do they believe in those two guys having rebound seasons? So it's going to be a very interesting offseason. Clearly, this didn't work. They won 93 games last year with roughly the same roster. Do you believe in everyone in that room to turn it around? I don't feel it. So the Sox have to make that call and what they decide to do.
And the guy who's been in that room the longest is Jose Abreu. And he has been the subject of a lot of – there's going to be this roster crunch where Andrew Vaughn, he's been too valuable to keep out of the lineup, but the glove in the outfield, it's just clear that he's not an outfielder. Abreu's production's been good, but it starts to dip. Where does Jose Abreu fall in that discussion? Do you think he'll be in a White Sox uniform next year?
And there's another piece to this whole puzzle. How does this all fit together? This is not a complete roster. And I think the feeling going in was, well, yeah, we have some guys playing out of position, like Sheets, like Vaughn. We have Eloy Jimenez in left. I think the feeling was we're going to score enough runs to make up for our defensive efficiencies. We're going to hit enough home runs to make up for where we're lacking in other places. But when that didn't happen, they didn't score enough runs, they didn't hit enough home runs, you got a team with, despite a roster filled with talent, is roughly a 500 team.
Yeah.
So it's a tough call. I could see it going both ways. They keep him and they figure this out again with Andrew Vaughn, or they don't keep him. You put Andrew Vaughn at first. Because the other thing is you have Eloy Jimenez. Is he a full-time DH? If you ask me, yes. So if he's a full-time DH, you've got Yasmani Grandal on the team, and he's a catcher/DH, right? They like to use him in the DH spot. Eloy Jimenez is going to take up all those DH spots. And if you have Jose Abreu at his age, he's going to need – you have to expect where's this trending for Abreu? Who's he going to be as a hitter next year? And you're going to play him all these games at first base? Like Miguel Cairo has been starting Eloy Jimenez every single day at DH except for one day. He gave him a day off, and he gave Abreu a day off because Abreu needed it because he'd played first base every day because Jimenez was playing DH every day. This is a Rubik's Cube that they got to figure out.
And the growing question is who's going to be the one solving that Rubik's Cube, because the narrative has kind of shifted from this is all on the manager. And now that and we'll get into this in a minute, that doesn't look like LaRussa is going to be back. The narrative has kind of shifted to no, it's not good enough if just the manager's gone. A lot of fans want House to be cleared. They want Kenny Williams gone, Rick Hahn, all these guys that have been making decisions. Do you see that as likely? Because, I mean, you have followed the White Sox, covered the White Sox longer than I have even known about baseball. And in your time covering a Jerry Reinsdorf team, do you think that them clearing House is realistic?
I mean, I don't know. I can't say realistic because since I've been covering this team, Kenny Williams and Rick Hahn have been there.
Yeah.
And so other teams would have, with other owners, they would have cleaned house months ago, rightly or wrongly, because sometimes they clean house and it gets worse or it doesn't get better. I'm not the person to say Kenny Williams should be fired or Rick Hahn should be fired. I can say this did not work and all parties are responsible, top to bottom. I don't know what's going to happen. And we could be sitting here in a year from now and those two could still be in their chairs and this team could be trending back in the right direction. I'd like to think that this front office learned a whole lot about this team in the last, not just this year, but last year. I mean, there were signs last year that I saw that this team, despite winning 93 games, had issues that needed to be addressed.
What were those signs?
When they matched up against the Astros and did not look like I was going to say a minor league team. That's wrong. They did not compare with them. This is a team that on the margins, especially in a playoff series, they are not good at the little things at all. And they're not great with execution. If they hit home runs, like last year, they're winning the game. Don't hit home runs, they're not winning the game. So if you go up against good pitching, close games in the playoffs, all the little things matter. And I think a lot of that happened last year. It was an inflated win total because they were playing so many bad teams and beating them to smithereens. They did have some good games against good teams, but for the most part, they were an inflated 93 win team. And things did not get better in 2022. It only got worse.
And I'd say on top of that, the last two Septembers had been like they had really limped to the postseason and just really didn't show any life, to the point of where like they had a great roster and had a great season and there's no momentum going into the playoffs. And now they won't even have to worry about that this year because they are not in the playoffs. And if it's going to be Hahn and it's going to be Williams still making the decisions, Miguel Cairo is going to be at the top of the list if Tony LaRussa really is not returning. Yesterday,
I wouldn't put him at the top of the list.
Why
would you put him at the top of the list?
I wouldn't say top of the list in terms of guys that they want, but I'm sure that they would interview him because he's been managing team for the past couple of weeks. For the first week, it was really good, and then everything since has been a disaster. But the players, at least for the first part, I'd say responded well to Cairo. What do you think about that?
So these were things we were talking about at the time. It looked like they were responding well to him. I think he played a part in it, but what seems to kind of get thrown under the rug a little bit or forgotten was the day after Cairo aired things out to the team, the players had a players-only meeting. And they themselves, it comes down to them. They decided as a team, let's go. We can do this. So I wasn't in the meeting. I don't know what was said. But that you needed Cairo to say that. You needed the players to believe it. Cairo did put Elvis Andrus in the leadoff spot, and that timed out perfectly because Andrus was playing like an all-star for a couple of weeks. He's not an all-star. He's been struggling for the last few games, but he played over his skis when they really needed him to, and I loved it. And he is a leader that this team is lacking, and I would consider bringing him back next year. In some capacity. But, there's only so much that a manager can do. I mean, it does do I want to say this? Managers do have an effect on a team. I'm one of those people that believe that. This team is lacking leadership and better in-game decisions. Cairo, I don't have a good read on him, whether he can really do that. If this team wants to contend next year, in my opinion, they need to get someone who's a better fit for where this team needs to go. And I'm not sure Cairo, with no managing experience other than right now, is the answer if they want to contend next year. I assume they do. I really hope they do.
I mean, I think that we all hope that. And blowing it up probably is the right call, but it just.
When I say blowing it up, I'm not saying like rebuild.
Yeah,
I'm not saying that. I'm saying blow some stuff up, like make some difficult decisions. Like anything's on the table. That's what I mean.
So one of a former guy with manager experience in-game decisions leader is one of your colleagues, Ozzie Guillen, and Ozzie has been very outspoken about wanting to return to the White Sox. Do you, and obviously you can't speak for Ozzie, but I want to ask more so about this aspect. You're with Ozzie a lot. You're with Scott Podsednik a lot. Those are former players, one former manager, both former World Series champions. When you are with those guys and you hear those guys, point out these things that are just fundamentally wrong about the way the team is being coached and the way the team is being ran, like what does that really show you? Because I think it's not very conventional in baseball where you have these players, former players on a team be so outspoken about the way the current team is ran. You see it more in football and in the NBA, but definitely not in Major League Baseball.
We have become, they have, and me and myself have become more outspoken this year, mainly because the expectations and not meeting the expectations. And, I give teams, White Sox players, a whole lot of rope every year, especially April, May, even into June, because there's a lot of stuff that happens and things get magnified early in seasons and then things turn around and, I don't want to jump to any kind of conclusions because it's a long season. And when they went through a rebuild, like, what are you supposed to do? You've got these guys who aren't going to be here next year or in the future. You're just going to like lay into them. I'm not going to do that because it's, I don't want to, and I'm speaking for Ozzie and Pods. We don't like to make things personal with any specific players. But the expectations, White Sox players were talking about World Series contention. I had Liam Hendricks on my podcast in spring training. He said we're going to be the most hated team in baseball, or one of the most hated teams in baseball this year, because people are going to want to play us. And so all these things were happening. April happened, May, June, and then we come on right after the game, and we know what the fans' expectations are. And if we were to come out in July and August and September and say everything's fine, everything's great, they'll win the division anyway, the people who are watching us wouldn't be authentic. And so so watching them, I don't want to speak for Ozzie and Pods, but they have a careful eye as to how a game should, how a team should play. And when you watch how the Guardians play, like, we are big fans of how they play the game and the effort that they bring, their hunger, their fire, their execution. The Guardians are here, and the White Sox have been here for most of the season.
Yeah. And I think that this is a great last final point to end on. I'm really glad that you kind of talked about how you and Scott Podsednik and Ozzie, y'all always try to be very impartial and not kind of make it personal with the players. And as someone who's on Twitter a lot, you're on Twitter a lot, the sentiment towards White Sox fans frequently, not just this year, it's been especially this year, but it's really been like this a lot, has been the fan base is very critical, and then they get upset that the media isn't critical, or they kind of sort of like to paint this picture that the media doesn't show the full story. How difficult has that been to do this year? Because, like, you can't be biased because you're doing the White Sox pre and post game show. You know, you're working for the White Sox essentially, but at the same time, you're covering this team that has been an all-out disaster, and the fans are outraged, and they have every right to be outraged. How do you find that middle ground as a reporter, as a media member?
It is a balance. I don't work for the White Sox. I work for NBC. There's a gray area there because, they're partners. And, I have to report on the team and also understand that there's a relationship there. But, I can tell you this, that not one White Sox person has said one thing to me about anything that I've said on the air this year. I think they would only, I guess I'm speaking for them, but I would say they just want us to be fair. And, the proof is in the pudding. What has happened with the product? If we were to say, oh, everything's fine and dandy, even they would disagree with us. So, yeah, it's a balance. And when you're in the clubhouse, I understand what it's like to be a beat writer. I'm not a beat writer, but I know all the beat writers. And you have a relationship with those teams and those players, coaches. And if you look back, when Ozzie was the manager, he got a lot more heat in the media because you had a lot more columnists for the Tribune, the Sun-Times. They would just helicopter in, blowtorch their way through the clubhouse, ask all the tough questions, and then just rip the team apart. Or they wouldn't even go to the clubhouse, like Jay Mariotti of the Sun-Times, and he would just be on his computer and he would just fire away. But those were different times. We really don't have those columnists anymore. What you do have, which is different, is you have social media. And 15, 20 years ago, there was no social media. All you had was media and an occasional blog or two in the beginning stages of the internet. So players today, I would rather have those columnists ripping the team apart, and it just goes away. It's in the newspaper and it goes away in a day, than what we have today. Social media.
Oh yeah.
I'm on Twitter. Social media, hate to say it, has been the worst thing for our society. I don't get me started on this, but I guess I've started. We have become very, very tribal, and people will say things on social media they would never say to somebody's face. And I think we as human beings are suffering from it in the biggest, most harmful way. I take part in Twitter. I like it. It's good for my brain. It's also awful for my brain and all of you who are listening to this. It's changing the chemical, the bounces of our brains going on social media and these phones. I wish I harkened back to 2005 when we just had newspapers and we didn't have access to information 24 hours a day. You woke up, you read the newspaper, and you did other stuff in your day, and we're not completely consumed with news 24 hours a day, 365 days a week. It's not healthy.
I completely agree with that. As someone who's studying journalism now and is on Twitter all the time, it is a battle. And you say it's all about finding a balance. You are somebody who has found that balance. Your coverage this season has been excellent. It has not been an easy season to cover. It has not been an easy season to watch. It's almost over, and it'll be interesting to see where we are at this point next year. But thank you very much for coming on and for talking some White Sox with us. It's been a long season. It's what everyone says with baseball, and glad that you could kind of tie the bow on it for us.
Yeah, and I'll say this: I'll take an interesting season over a bad season any day. Give me, this was in terms of stories and things to talk about. We had a lot to talk about. I'm always hoping they win. I always would prefer to do a winning post-game show. Unfortunately, we had too many losing post-game shows, and I'm hopeful that they will be better next year, and it'll be more fun to cover this team. And thanks for having me on. I appreciate it, Jason.
Of course, Chuck. Thank you very much for joining us. His stuff can be found over on his Twitter at Chuck Garfien, obviously NBC Sports Chicago White Sox pre- and post-game show, and he is the host of the White Sox Talk podcast. Thank you again for joining us, Chuck.
All right, Jason. Appreciate it.
Well, it was awesome, as always, to hear from Chuck Garfien. Very interesting insight, especially on his relationship with Ozzie Guillen and Scott Podsednik. And from a media standpoint, the way that they have went about covering this team, especially as the season has went on, super interesting. And I think that every White Sox fan needs to hear Chuck's quote about how the White Sox never once approached him saying that they had a problem with anything that he had said or tweeted. I think that those guys catch a lot of heat, unnecessary heat on Twitter about carrying water, what have you. It's a tough job, and it's a tough team to cover. And somebody like Chuck does an amazing job with it. And we're very lucky to have him on to bring in some insight on what went wrong this season and how it can maybe be fixed next season. So we don't have my mom here to kind of introduce the predictions, but a big part of our show is my 3 predictions, and I have 3 red hot predictions prepared for us today. My first one is going to be baseball related. Actually, all of these are going to be baseball related. Staying on topic, only one is White Sox related, and we'll get to that at the end. My first prediction is going to be my World Series prediction. At first, it was White Sox Mets. White Sox won't make the playoffs, so I won't have to worry about that part. But the New York Mets are going to be in the playoffs, and they have been very fun to follow this season. Max Scherzer, Jacob deGrom. No team has had more players on the injured list. No team has been more fun to watch. Edwin Diaz has been absolutely electric in the 9th inning. I love the Mets from top to bottom. They have a competitive lineup. Buck Showalter's playoff experience, great rotation, and a great bullpen built for postseason success. New York Mets are my World Series champions. Number 2 prediction, and this is going to be Cubs related. A lot of talk on the Cubs spending going into this offseason. They will have money to spend between Marquee and just because they have very few future commitments after the season with Jason Hayward gone. I'm going to say that the Cubs are going to make a big splash, but it won't be the big splash that they had been rumored to make for a while, and that is Carlos Correa. Instead, I'm going to predict that the starting shortstop for the Chicago Cubs next season is going to be Xander Bogaerts from the Boston Red Sox. Bogaerts is a perennial MVP candidate at shortstop. He's a great hitter. He's an amazing fielder. He's a perennial all-star as well. Made his major league debut in the 2013 postseason and ended that postseason World Series champion. So this guy has produced ever since he's been in the league. For those of us who follow baseball, he is a household name, would be a great investment for the Cubs. And I think that he fits what they're trying to do with this balanced approach, not going too power heavy, not going too defense heavy. They're getting guys that are good at multiple things, 5-tool players. Bogaerts is like that. My third and final prediction, and we touched upon this with Chuck, I'm going to predict that Jose Abreu will be elsewhere at the start of next season. And the reason why I'm predicting this is because the White Sox have an obvious roster crunch. That roster crunch is they have about 4 to 5 guys who can play DH, who should play DH, and really only 1 or 2 guys in Eloy Jimenez / Jose Abreu or Andrew Vaughn that should be playing DH. So with Andrew Vaughn, whose bat is too good to keep him out of the lineup, but the glove is really too bad to keep him in the outfield for too long, a decision needs to be made. And it's a difficult decision. As Chuck pointed out, the White Sox front office will need to make difficult decisions this winter. This will be the most difficult decision, what to do with Jose Abreu. And I think that the White Sox are going to need to rip off the Band-Aid and tell Jose, thanks for everything since 2014, but Andrew Vaughn's our first baseman from now on. And given that Abreu is going to be a free agent this offseason, White Sox won't have to trade him. They won't have to non-tender him. So that's going to be, I'm going to have to say that Andrew Vaughn is going to be the starting first baseman. Jose Abreu will be elsewhere. One thing that my mom loves to do on these shows is give her final thoughts at the end of the episode. So since my mom is not here with us today, I figured that I would give my final thoughts, and some of you are going to want to listen to this. A big part of being very involved in sports and in sports media is knowing when you're wrong. And I am overdue admitting that I was wrong about this year's White Sox team. I predicted that this year's White Sox team would go 162. Predicted that they would be World Series champions. I predicted that Luis Robert would win the MVP. All of those were so far off the mark. I apologize for being wrong. I apologize that I did not see earlier that this White Sox team was not going to work out. But what I will not apologize for is having hope going into the season, because that's the fun of sports. And what I hope for this White Sox team is that amidst all the chaos of this year, amidst everything going on in the front office and with the coaching staff, I hope that next year, come March, there's a clear vision for this team and that there's still excitement for this team. And more importantly, I hope that next year, come September, our White Sox season recap isn't a season recap. It's a White Sox season postseason preview. So that's what I hope for next season. And baseball is an amazing sport. I don't think that a full rebuild is a great idea. Neither does Chuck. So we'll see what ends up happening with these White Sox. But I really wanted to get that out there. I was wrong. I'm sorry. I apologize. I hope for better next year. Couple thank yous to run through before y'all leave us for this episode. First and foremost, I would like to thank ESPN Chicago for having our show on their app. It's awesome getting to be affiliated with them, have our show on the app. It's such a cool place to listen. The primary place to find the Sportscaster and her son. Big thank you to them. In that, I would also like to thank our producer, Jake Cantu. Does an awesome job of editing the shows, works with my mom every single week. So we really appreciate the work that he does for us. And lastly, I would like to thank you. I'd like to thank our followers and subscribers for giving me this platform, for letting me do solo shows and letting me talk about my passion, which is White Sox baseball. As always, you know where to check out our shows, videos posted on YouTube, the Sportscaster and Her Son podcast, audio on the ESPN 1000 app, Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple Music, wherever you find your audio, you will find our podcast. Lastly, we have a Twitter at TSAHS Pod, on Twitter at THASH Pod. I promise I'll get that locked down eventually. That is where we post clips leading up to the shows, latest news about the podcast, and we have merch coming out pretty soon. So we will be dropping the link to merch live on that Twitter. Do not miss it. Thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure being able to do this one by myself. You could follow me on Twitter at Jason Conander. I tweet about the White Sox. I tweet about the Texas Longhorns. I tweet about being a college student. So you can check out more of my stuff there. You know where you can check out our show. Have a great day.